Hey gang, I'm back. So, I came across a speaker insinuating there's no way to prove the existence of a deity to atheists because we wouldn't accept any evidence. Let's take a look.
Are atheists open-minded? Many atheists I talk to say, of course, I'm open-minded. Show me the evidence or proof that God exists, and I'll believe. But when they're presented with proofs for the existence of God, those same atheists will say, that's just fallacious God of the gaps reasoning. Your evidence for God comes from ignorance. You say, I don't know what caused the Big Bang, therefore God did it. I'd rather wait for science to provide the correct explanation and not rush to put God in a gap of my knowledge.
Well, yeah. If you use a logical fallacy to prove that a deity, or really anything exists, then that argument will get called out for, well, being a logical fallacy. Do you have any evidence that isn't based on not knowing what caused something? There are very few scientists who will publish a paper saying, we have absolutely no evidence of the cause of this phenomena, but since we don't know, I'm going to slot in a tale I was told as a kid as an explanation, and everyone should accept it. What proofs do you have that aren't just, we don't know, therefore God?
But if you say that any possible evidence for God isn't good enough, then you aren't really open-minded. You assumed that no evidence is good enough, so you've already made up your mind beforehand.
No, I have not said that. I simply said that bad evidence is not convincing. The majority of proofs for God are along the lines of something must have started the universe, created biological diversity, decided what is good or evil, and that something is God, which is bad reasoning. Show evidence that points to a God. Not that you can't think of anything else and to decide that God's the explanation, but evidence, and you'll be on your way to proving your claim that a deity exists.
If you're an atheist, take a minute and try to honestly answer this question. What specific evidence would convince you that God exists?
This is not how proof works. You can't just make up a claim, in this case that a deity exists, and then expect others to tell you what would prove your claims true. You're the one making the claim. In this case, there's a creator deity. What evidence do you have to support that claim? Biologists don't say Darwinian evolution via natural selection is true. What evidence would convince you? Because people who don't understand evolution would say something like, show me one species giving birth to a completely separate species.
In essence, the idea at least that a lizard lays an egg and out comes a bird fully formed with wings and tail feathers.
A proper scientist would explain the theory they want to convince others of, then will show evidence that supports that theory. Now, maybe, in the same way, I'm misunderstanding the claims of what a deity is, in which case I would be unable to tell you what evidence would convince me because I may not understand what exactly you define as a god.
Don't say what type of evidence would convince you. Come up with a specific example.
Well, as I just said, the person making the claim should be able to come up with the evidence. However, I did play this game once, and here's the specific example I gave. I had a believer who asked what evidence would be convincing that their deity exists. They were arguing from a Christian standpoint, so I used that as my starting base. I used 3 points for this proof. As I understand it, this concept of God will answer the prayers of believers. Additionally, it knows everything happening everywhere. And finally, this God is able to control weather patterns. I take it these concepts are accepted by believers who use the Bible as their base. Now, as my viewers may know, I'm a bit of a Star Wars fan. Anyway, I propose this test. After I get home from work, I do my standard exercise routine, usually jogging on the treadmill for at least 4 kilometers and lifting weights. Depending on how I'm feeling, I vary the speed, and therefore the time I run will vary. Additionally, I usually put something on the TV to watch as I exercise. For the believer who wanted to know what would convince me, I suggested this. I would watch one of the dozen or so Star Wars films I had in my collection. I would watch them on my Blu-ray player, which was not hooked up to the internet, so it was on a closed system. I would be sequestered in my basement and would run my standard distance, but not know how long it would take. At the end of my workout, I would take note of the scene I was watching. Nobody else but me would know which film I was watching or where it was when I stopped. I proposed that the believer who asked me what proof I would want should pray to his God to have the clouds form to the scene I stopped at, where I would be able to see them once I left my office the next day. This would be a starting point to convince me that prayer was able to affect the world in such a way that it would point to some kind of intelligence that satisfied the understood conditions of a deity. Specifically, answers prayers, is omniscient, and is able to physically affect the world. Surprisingly, they never took me up on it. Now, I'll be the first to admit that if this test failed, that wouldn't prove that there wasn't a deity out there. There could be one that simply didn't fit this understood biblical concept of God.
A common one I hear is that if after praying an amputated limb grew back, then the person would believe in God. But isn't that a God of the gaps argument? Aren't you saying, I don't know what caused this limb to grow back, therefore God did it?
If there was a case of a limb growing back, no, my first thought would not be that a god regrew it. I could think of several explanations that could explain it, but I wouldn't say they're the correct ones until I had some evidence of the claims. It could be someone who's a mutant, a human somehow spliced with salamander DNA, possibly some new medical breakthrough. It could even be a time-traveling robot that is actually liquid metal.
Goddamn time-traveling robots covering up their goddamn tracks. Knew it.
But if you could somehow show, in a controlled setting, a connection between a deity and this limb regrowth, then that would go towards pointing to the existence of a deity. I realize that correlation does not equal causation, but if you claim that prayer did cause limbs to grow back, we could test that theory and see if it panned out. If you could show that limbs miraculously grew back after, and only after a prayer, with a large enough test group and control group of amputees, one of which was prayed for versus ones that were not prayed for, and show that the limbs grew back for those that were prayed for, but not for those that were not prayed for, then you could point to prayer as being a factor in the regrowth. Once you've done that, and shown that prayer does cause limbs to regrow, you could even narrow that down and see what religion's prayers work for, and even which specific sects allow regrowth of missing limbs. All this would point to a deity receiving said prayers and responding to them. But this is all a moot point, since prayer has never resulted in a documented case of a limb growing back. There are approximately 185,000 amputations in the United States every year, meaning there are, on average, over 500 amputations a day. Since America is one of the most religious first world countries in the world, you would think that at least some of these people who lost a limb would pray, or be prayed for, to have it grow back, which has not happened yet.
The arguments for the existence of God don't take the form of, I don't know, therefore God. Instead, they take the form of, there are good reasons to believe effect X can never be explained naturally. Therefore, it must have a supernatural explanation, or God. If you agree that limbs can't come into existence from nothing, and therefore any such regrown limbs require a divine cause, then if the universe came into existence from nothing, wouldn't that require a divine cause? If not, why not?
As I said, no. Something we don't understand happening in and of itself does not point to a divine cause. If we could use repeatable evidence that points towards a deity being the cause of something we don't understand, the regenerating limb test for example, that would be a start. Scientists run the same tests over and over and over, and over and over and over, and over and over and over and over and over and over again to confirm their theories are the correct explanation. A limb simply growing back with no explanation would go against our current understanding of the universe, but not directly point to a god. A number of limbs that grew back that were prayed for, while ones that were not prayed over did not, and all other variables taken into account, could anecdotally point to praying to a deity as the explanation for regrowth. But more testing would be required to show a connection between prayer and limb regeneration. To say that a deity created the universe, we would need something that pointed towards the universe being created as the explanation. So far, no evidence for such a being has been put forward.
If you're truly open-minded, then check out the reasons for God that the best philosophers, past and present, have put forward. Even if they don't convince you, at least after critically examining them, you'll be able to say why they don't convince you. That's better than just assuming they don't succeed and not bothering to do some critical thinking on one of the most important questions of all time.
I find it interesting that you don't actually list the arguments for a deity that you claim we should check out. But I have gone out to try to see what standard arguments are used. Every argument that I have been given for a deity boils down to either, you can't explain this, therefore God, special pleading for a deity, or just appeals to emotion. These all posit that God exists as an explanation, but don't actually show an existing. What evidence do you have that specifically points to a deity? Simply saying, I don't know what caused something, therefore God, is knowing your ignorance and slotting a deity as the default explanation for things you have no evidence for. If that was sound scientific reasoning, we would not bother looking for things like electron flow and have to conclude that lightning was caused by a Scandinavian with a large hammer.
Long ago in days of yore, it all began with a god named Thor. There were Vikings and boats and some plans for a furniture store.